Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Salem. And my suit tonight is for Margie Isapik, and our question comes from After Fove. And our question tonight has to do with justice and the gods. And this is something that I'm quite certain I've talked about in other vlogs, but it's a subject that always bears coming back to. And there's a number of things that I can say on the subject of justice and the gods, but the thing that I think is most important to discuss is the fact that what we commonly think of under the term justice is the rules that we live by here in the physical world. The laws that we follow, the social customs, etc., which, as I understand it, and as I look at it, and as I teach it, are part of the social contract that we make with one another to live in peace. It has very little to do necessarily with any sort of divine law. It's very much a human law, and we do it in accordance to what we can stand to live with. And I think the law is very important, and I'm definitely not a believer in anarchy, because without law and without rules, we can't really get along. And I think that it would take very little time for us to be killing each other right and left if we did not have such a social contract. And as it is, of course, people do that plenty anyway. And so imagine if we didn't have rules that we live by that help us to keep peace. And so, when we talk about justice in a human sense, the main purpose is to keep peace. And, you know, as the head of a tradition, I can tell you having rules to help keep peace is really, really important, because people don't always like to get along. And often when they're not getting along, both parties will think that they're absolutely right, and unless you have an agreed upon standard of conduct, or at least something reasonably approaching this, it's very hard to get people to agree that maybe they need to change something in order to get along. I am not also a believer in the idea of peace at any cost either. I think that peace is a very important thing. I think that we have laws to help us live in peace. But peace at any cost is not a good idea, because it can be a very, very high cost. Sometimes I think you have to stand up for what you believe in, and you have to stand up for what you cannot live with, as much as you stand up for what you want to live with. So these are some of my thoughts on justice in the human sense. Now, justice and the gods. I think that After Fove's basic question is based on another video by another commentator on the idea that God is not just. And I think that this is a common problem in certain religions, particularly many branches of the Christian religion, where people confuse the idea of human justice and divine justice, and assume that the rules we live by and the rules God lives by are the same rules. And this brings us back to what I was just saying. Our rules that we live by are a social contract between us. It changes according to our culture, the age we live in, sometimes even our social standing. And it has everything to do with the moment that we are in. Things that we consider to be terribly, terribly unjust, such as slavery, for example, were once normally accepted parts of behavior. Things that we consider to be perfectly normal behavior 100 years from now may be considered terribly, terribly unjust. Because our understanding of what is and is not just, and also our social agreements, are constantly evolving. Now, when we look at God, the gods, deity, whatever you want to call it, when we look at the powers of the universe, they obviously are not running on the same train. I believe that deity is ultimately extremely just. However, it has a point of view that is eternal and all-encompassing. It is not our momentary point of view from our particular point of consciousness. And I believe that everything that happens for a reason which is ultimately for the good, and which is ultimately just, from that eternal and all-encompassing point of view. Not necessarily from our momentary point of view. I was raised with very strong influence from Lady Bitterwind. Some of you are familiar with Lady Bitterwind. Some of you perhaps are not as familiar with her, but she is very strong on her point of view regarding nature and deity. Most of her artworks celebrate the idea of the balance of nature, the balance between predator and prey, the balance between life and death, the fact that all of these things are part of nature, therefore they are part of God, therefore they are ultimately, cosmically speaking, just. However, doesn't necessarily mean that we would want to have that as our social contract between one another. Now, in the Christian religion, they talk about the lion laying down with the lamb. Anyone who's paid any attention to nature whatsoever will know the lion does not lay down with the lamb unless it happens to be eating it. Now, obviously, this is how deity intends it to be, or it would not be that way. Now, it is not what we would want in a social contract between each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that from that cosmic all-encompassing point of view there's anything unjust about it. The lion is what the lion is, the lamb is what the lamb is, and the lion does not lay down with the lamb unless it is eating it. This is simply the nature of being. And it must, by virtue of being the way things are, it must ultimately and cosmically be just. However, again, it isn't necessarily what we want for a social contract between ourselves. Things that we consider unjust today, such as, for example, slavery, or, for example, hereditary aristocracy, were considered perfectly normal and completely just, in fact, even the measure of justice in some cases in previous generations. Things we consider very just today, such as equality between the sexes, would once have been considered unjust in certain societies. And so we must be very conscious, I think, of the fact that our social contracts are constantly evolving and specific to the time in which we live. When we work with reincarnation, we find we've lived in many times and places where points of view are not always the same, and this frequently will cause an imbalance in the soul, when energy will be blocked because of the divergence between the social patterns of a past life and a present life. This is particularly true when you find a person who is living in the present society, but has important past lives in societies that were notably bloodier, or different in other important ways that cause a dissonance within the spirit. When we work with past lives, one of the things that we do is try to balance this, try to bring it into alignment and release that blocked energy. So, these are some of my thoughts on the matter, and I hope you find them helpful. And until next time, may you blessed be. Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Salem, and I'm very pleased to announce the brand new World of Witches Museum program book full of stories and pictures from our museum here in Salem. And you can have your very own copy for just $9.99. Find it today at witchghoulstore.com.